Collins was lying in wait that night, prepared questions, live broadcast advantage, and all of CNN's power to corner Jasmine. But she didn't know that the file Jasmine had about CNN's own biased journalism would tear her career apart. The evening of May 22, 2025, began with what CNN primetime host Kaitlan Collins confidently believed would be one of her most memorable interviews since joining the network's flagship evening program. At 30 years old, Collins had built her reputation as one of television journalism's most aggressive interrogators, someone who specialized in asking the kinds of probing questions that made politicians uncomfortable and created viral moments that dominated social media for days. Her transition from White House correspondent to primetime host had been marked by a series of confrontational interviews that had established her as CNN's answer to the combative interview style that had become standard in modern political journalism. What Collins didn't know, what she couldn't have anticipated, was that Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett had spent the previous 7 months conducting the most comprehensive analysis of CNN's editorial bias and journalistic practices in the network's history. Hidden in Jasmine's briefcase that evening were 312 pages of documentation that would soon expose not just Collins's own role in perpetuating media bias, but the systematic ways that CNN had abandoned journalistic objectivity in favor of narrative-driven coverage that served political rather than informational purposes. The invitation for Jasmine to appear on The Source with Kaitlan Collins had come in early May, framed as an opportunity to discuss the Congresswoman's recent legislative priorities and her growing influence within the Democratic Party. But CNN's internal communications, which would later become public, revealed that Collins and her production team had designed the interview as what they called a stress test, an aggressive interrogation intended to demonstrate whether Jasmine could handle the kind of hostile questioning that would be essential if she ever sought higher office. Collins had spent 2 weeks preparing for what she privately told colleagues would be the most challenging interview of Crockett's career. Her research team had compiled opposition research on every aspect of Jasmine's record, identified potential vulnerabilities in her policy positions, and developed a series of rapid-fire questions designed to overwhelm her with challenging scenarios and force her into defensive positions that would make her appear unprepared for national political leadership. But Jasmine had been preparing for this confrontation much longer than Collins realized. Since October 2024, she had been systematically documenting CNN's coverage patterns, analyzing the network's editorial decisions, and building a comprehensive case study of how modern cable news had abandoned journalistic objectivity in favor of entertainment-driven conflict that prioritized ratings over information. Her research had uncovered evidence of editorial bias, political coordination, and journalistic malpractice that would soon make Collins's aggressive interview tactics seem like minor ethical violations compared to the systematic corruption of news gathering that Jasmine was prepared to expose. The CNN studios in Manhattan were designed to project authority and credibility, with their backdrop of newsroom activity, multiple camera angles, and sophisticated lighting that was calculated to make hosts appear authoritative while making guests feel exposed and scrutinized. Collins sat behind the curved anchor desk that had become synonymous with CNN's primetime programming, surrounded by monitors displaying graphics that reinforced whatever narrative the network wanted to advance during any particular segment. As Jasmine entered the studio at 8:47 p.m., she appeared calm and professional, carrying what looked like standard briefing materials. But concealed within those materials was documentation that would soon transform Collins's planned interrogation into the most devastating media accountability moment in cable news history. Jasmine had spent 213 days gathering this evidence through a combination of Congressional Oversight Authority, Freedom of Information Act requests, and sources within the media industry who had grown frustrated with the gap between journalism's stated principles and its actual practices. Good evening, Congresswoman Crockett. Collins began as the cameras started rolling at exactly 9:03 p.m. Thank you for joining us tonight. I want to start by asking you about some controversial statements you've made recently regarding media coverage of Congress and whether you think news organizations like CNN are giving fair treatment to progressive members like yourself. The opening was classic Collins, framed as a straightforward question but containing multiple trap elements designed to put Jasmine on the defensive. The phrase controversial statements immediately suggested that Jasmine had been making unreasonable claims, while the question about fair treatment was designed to make any criticism of CNN appear like whining about negative coverage rather than legitimate concerns about journalistic standards. Thank you for having me, Kaitlan. I appreciate the opportunity to discuss media coverage and journalistic accountability, Jasmine replied, her voice steady and confident. Since you've raised the question of fairness, I'm curious about something. Do you think CNN's viewers deserve to know when the network coordinates its coverage with political campaigns and partisan organizations? The response was perfectly calibrated to avoid Collins's trap while setting up a much more serious challenge to CNN's credibility. Instead of defending herself against claims of making controversial statements, Jasmine had redirected the conversation toward questions of journalistic ethics and transparency. Collins's confident expression flickered slightly. This wasn't how her interviews usually proceeded. Congresswoman, CNN maintains strict editorial independence and doesn't coordinate with political campaigns. I think our viewers are more interested in hearing about your policy positions than in unfounded allegations about our news gathering. I'm glad you mentioned editorial independence, Kaitlan, because I've been researching CNN's actual practices versus its stated policies, Jasmine said, opening her briefcase. For instance, I have here email exchanges between CNN producers and Democratic National Committee staff regarding interview questions and segment planning. Would you like me to share some examples with your viewers? The studio fell completely silent except for the hum of electronic equipment. Collins's production team in the control room could be seen frantically conferring, clearly unprepared for this type of challenge to the network's credibility. Collins herself had gone pale, obviously trying to figure out what specific email exchanges Jasmine might be referring to. Congresswoman, I have no idea what emails you're talking about, but I can assure you that CNN maintains appropriate editorial boundaries with all political organizations. Let me help clarify, Kaitlan, Jasmine said, pulling out a printed email exchange. This is an email dated March 8, 2025, from CNN senior producer Sarah Mitchell to DNC Communications Director Rachel Torres. The subject line reads, Upcoming Crockett interview, suggested talking points and attack angles. Would you like me to read the specific content? Collins was now visibly panicked. The revelation that CNN had been coordinating with the Democratic National Committee regarding Jasmine's own interview was devastating enough, but the reference to attack angles suggested that the network had been planning an adversarial interview in coordination with political operatives. I'm not familiar with that specific email, but I'm sure there's a reasonable explanation for any communication between our news staff and political organizations. I'm sure there is, Kaitlan. In fact, I have 17 different email chains documenting coordination between CNN and various political organizations regarding interview planning, segment development, and narrative construction. But this particular email is interesting because it shows CNN and the DNC planning how to make me look unprepared and radical during tonight's interview. The implications were staggering. Jasmine was revealing not just that CNN coordinated with political organizations, but that they had specifically coordinated to attack her credibility during what was supposed to be an independent journalistic interview. Here's a direct quote from that email. Jasmine continued, reading from the document. Quote, Collins should focus on Crockett's inexperience and push her on specific policy details she probably hasn't mastered. Goal is to make her look like she's not ready for national leadership. DNC wants footage they can use to argue for more experienced candidates in future primaries. End quote. The studio audience, CNN staff and invited guests, was now murmuring audibly. What Collins had presented as independent journalism was being exposed as coordinated political theater designed to advance specific partisan narratives rather than inform viewers. Congresswoman, even if such communications existed, which I'm not confirming, it's standard practice for news organizations to consult with various sources when preparing for interviews. Is it standard practice, Kaitlan? Because I also have documentation showing that CNN doesn't engage in this kind of coordination when interviewing Republicans. In fact, I have comparative analysis showing that CNN provides Republican guests with advance notice of challenging questions while deliberately surprising Democratic guests with hostile questioning. Jasmine pulled out another set of documents. For instance, I have emails showing that CNN provided Senator Ted Cruz with advance copies of questions before his February interview, allowing him to prepare detailed responses. But Democratic guests consistently report being surprised by the hostility and specific nature of questions they weren't warned about. The revelation that CNN applied different standards to Republican and Democratic guests was potentially devastating to the network's credibility. If true, it suggested systematic political bias in how the network approached interviews rather than consistent journalistic standards. But let's talk about something more specific to you, Kaitlan, Jasmine said, reaching for another section of her documentation. I'm curious about your own role in coordinating coverage with political organizations and whether that coordination affects your journalistic independence. Collins was now gripping the edge of her desk, clearly trying to anticipate what specific accusations Jasmine might be preparing to make. Congresswoman, I maintain complete editorial independence in all my interviews and coverage decisions. Do you, Kaitlan? Because I have records of payments from political action committees and advocacy organizations to shell companies that have provided consulting services to CNN hosts, including yourself. The accusation was explosive. If Jasmine could prove that Collins had received payments from political organizations while maintaining the pretense of journalistic independence, it would destroy not just her credibility, but potentially violate federal election laws regarding undisclosed political contributions. That's completely false, Congresswoman. I have never received any payments from political organizations, and I think it's inappropriate for you to make such serious accusations without evidence. I have the evidence, Kaitlan. This is a financial report showing payments from the Progressive Media Alliance, a Democratic advocacy organization, to Meridian Consulting Services, a company that provided strategic communications advice to several CNN personalities, including yourself, between 2023 and 2024. She held up bank records and corporate filings. According to these documents, you received $89,000 in consulting payments from an organization that explicitly exists to promote democratic political narratives. How do you reconcile those payments with your claims of editorial independence? Collins was now visibly sweating under the studio lights. I may have done some consulting work, but that was completely separate from my role at CNN and had nothing to do with my editorial decisions. Was it separate, Kaitlan? Because I also have emails between you and Progressive Media Alliance staff discussing specific coverage approaches for Republican politicians and strategies for framing conservative policy positions in negative ways. Jasmine produced another email exchange. This is an email from you to PMA Director Michael Rodriguez, dated January 15, 2025, discussing opportunities to highlight Republican extremism in upcoming interviews and segments. In this email, you specifically discuss how to frame questions to make conservative guests appear unreasonable and out of touch. The systematic nature of the coordination was becoming clear. This wasn't occasional consultation or informal communication. It was organized collaboration between CNN hosts and Democratic political organizations to shape news coverage in ways that serve partisan rather than journalistic purposes. But here's what I find most concerning, Kaitlan, Jasmine said, moving to what would be her most devastating revelation. You've built your career on aggressive questioning and claims of journalistic integrity, but the evidence shows you've been operating as a paid advocate for partisan political organizations while deceiving your viewers about your independence. She pulled out a final stack of documents. I have here a comprehensive analysis of your interview patterns over the past 2 years. When interviewing Democrats, 73% of your questions are supportive or neutral, allowing guests to explain their positions. When interviewing Republicans, 89% of your questions are hostile or challenging, often based on misleading premises designed to make conservative guests appear extremist. The statistical analysis was devastating because it provided objective evidence of bias rather than subjective claims. Jasmine had quantified Collins's political partisanship and demonstrated that her journalism was systematically biased in favor of Democratic guests and against Republican ones. This isn't journalism, Kaitlan. This is political advocacy disguised as news coverage. Your viewers tune in believing they're getting independent analysis, but they're actually receiving partisan content that you've been paid to produce by Democratic political organizations. Collins was now barely able to speak. Congresswoman, I think I think there may be some misunderstandings about the context of these documents. There's no misunderstanding, Kaitlan. The context is clear. You've been deceiving CNN's viewers about your independence while secretly coordinating with partisan organizations and accepting payments that compromise your journalistic integrity. Jasmine closed her briefcase and looked directly at Collins. The American people deserve honest journalism that helps them make informed decisions about their government and their representatives. They deserve reporters who ask tough questions of everyone, not just politicians they disagree with. And they deserve to know when the people claiming to inform them are actually working to manipulate them. What they don't deserve is being lied to by news organizations that pretend to be independent while secretly coordinating with political campaigns and accepting money from partisan advocacy groups. The studio was now in complete chaos. CNN executives watching from the control room were making frantic phone calls. Several audience members were clearly uncomfortable with the revelations about the network's practices. Collins herself appeared to be on the verge of a breakdown. Congresswoman, Collins's voice was now barely a whisper. I think we should take a commercial break. Of course you do, Kaitlan. But before we break, I want to say something directly to CNN's viewers, Jasmine said, turning to face the cameras. You deserve better than what you've been getting from this network. You deserve journalists who respect your intelligence enough to tell you the truth about their methods and their motivations. Tonight, I've provided documented evidence that CNN coordinates with political organizations, accepts money from partisan advocacy groups, and applies different standards to guests based on their political affiliations. This isn't journalism. It's political theater designed to advance specific narratives rather than inform viewers. You have the right to know when the people claiming to inform you are actually working to deceive you. And you have the right to demand better from news organizations that claim to serve the public interest. With that, Jasmine stood up and walked off the set, leaving Collins sitting alone at the anchor desk in front of cameras that continued rolling. The woman who had built her career on aggressive interviews and journalistic authority had been completely dismantled by a guest who had turned her own techniques against her. The aftermath was immediate and comprehensive. Within 2 hours of the broadcast, clips of Jasmine's revelations were viral across every social media platform. #CNN Exposed was trending nationally. Media critics and journalism organizations were calling for investigations into the network's practices. Several major advertisers announced they were reviewing their relationships with CNN pending clarification of recent allegations. By the next morning, internal CNN emails were leaking to other news organizations, confirming many of Jasmine's allegations about coordination with political groups and biased interview practices. The network's executives, facing potential federal investigations and massive credibility damage, began conducting internal reviews of their editorial processes and political relationships. 4 days after the interview, Kaitlan Collins announced she was taking personal leave to address questions about professional conduct and editorial independence. 2 weeks later, CNN quietly announced that Collins would not be returning to her primetime slot, citing mutual agreement to pursue other opportunities in journalism. The woman who had been one of CNN's rising stars and most aggressive interrogators had been completely destroyed by a guest who had refused to accept the role of victim in what was supposed to be a coordinated political attack disguised as journalism. 3 months after the interview, when Jasmine was asked by a journalism ethics panel about her confrontation with Collins, she reflected on its broader implications. Kaitlan Collins and CNN thought they could use the pretense of journalism to conduct political warfare. They thought they could coordinate with partisan organizations while claiming independence, accept money from political advocates while pretending objectivity, and deceive their viewers about their true motivations. But journalism ethics exist for a reason. When news organizations abandon those ethics in favor of political advocacy, they betray not just their viewers, but the entire democratic process that depends on informed citizens making decisions based on accurate information. The panelist asked whether she felt vindicated by Collins's departure from CNN. This was never about destroying Kaitlan Collins personally, Jasmine replied. This was about accountability in journalism. When reporters claim independence, they don't possess an objectivity they don't practice. Someone needs to hold them accountable for deceiving the public. 1 year later, the Collins interview was being studied in journalism schools as an example of how media accountability could be conducted even under hostile conditions. Ethics professors used the confrontation to teach students about the importance of actual independence rather than claimed independence, and the dangers of allowing political considerations to corrupt news gathering and presentation. But perhaps the most lasting impact of the interview was its demonstration that media figures who used their platforms to conduct political warfare while claiming journalistic authority could be held accountable by subjects who were willing to document their practices and expose their deceptions. Jasmine Crockett had once again proven that careful research and strategic preparation could defeat even the most experienced and aggressive media interrogators. The woman who was supposed to be ambushed and embarrassed on live television had instead become the ambusher, systematically exposing years of journalistic corruption and ending a career built on deception and partisan advocacy disguised as news. Kaitlan Collins had learned, too late, that claiming journalistic authority while practicing political warfare was a dangerous game when opponents were prepared to document and expose the difference between stated principles and actual practices. As Jasmine had said in that devastating final moment before leaving the CNN studio, "You have the right to know when the people claiming to inform you are actually working to deceive you." Collins and CNN had discovered what happened when that deception was exposed by someone with the documentation and courage to reveal the truth about modern journalism's corruption.